Sabatier.
Thank you so much, Celia, and thanks for all of you for coming. I'm so excited to be part of Creative Mornings. It's true, I haven't been able to come to a Creative Mornings event because I work on a previously 9 a.m. show, but now it's at noon, so my mornings are a little more flexible. So who here has heard Destination DIY before? Okay, a few of you, great. So it's on Oregon Public Broadcasting at 9 p.m. on Tuesdays right now, but you can always catch it on the podcast. And we're based in Portland, but we talk about people all over the country and all over the world doing interesting and innovative things. And we feature stories about why people make things and about what happens along the way. So if you listen to the show, you're probably not going to learn how to do anything quite literally, but you might be inspired to do something. That's what we hope. The show is called Destination DIY, and because that's the title, people often ask me what I make and do myself. And you know, I make fruits and vegetables in my garden, and right now I'm actually growing flowers for my wedding, which is in 22 days. And I make jam and ketchup and things, but mostly what I make is radio. That's my DIY project, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, about how we find people to talk to and about what goes into creating a radio story. So there's a lot of behind the scenes that you might not have thought about. And my rule of thumb is that a minute of pre-recorded radio takes about an hour of work. And that means, you know, research, pre-interviewing, an actual interview, editing, all that stuff. It kind of translates. So our show is about an hour. It's 59 minutes, so it takes between 60 and 80 hours to produce. And in a lot of ways, it's pretty basic. I come up with ideas, I ask questions, I try to figure out who has the best answers to my questions, and I put it all together in a way that I'm hoping will hit your ear just right. I'm first and foremost a journalist, and the thing that I like about having my own show is that I get to follow my own curiosity. And, you know, I'm interested in all kinds of weird stuff, like home funerals, for example. There's a home funeral movement that's got some pretty strong supporters in Oregon, actually, and I spoke to a woman who knows a lot about this for our DIY rituals episode. Her name is Patricia Sweeney, and she calls herself a death midwife. She teaches people how to conduct home funerals. I did a little research for this interview, but mostly what I did to prepare was to compile all the questions that I could think of and that my friends could think of about what it takes to do a funeral yourself. And we talked about all the reasons why people might want to do this, and Patricia told me that there's kind of a spectrum, and a memorial service held at home is kind of on one end of the spectrum, and a full-on funeral, like there's a body in your living room, is on the other end. And embalming, I should say, is not part of the process when you're doing it yourself. It's, you have to have that done by a professional. If somebody's going to be embalmed, there are some requirements where you actually, I discovered this in my research, have to be embalmed if you died of communicable disease or if you're taking the body across state lines for some reason. But that did leave me wondering, and so I asked Patricia this question.
Let's say someone doesn't meet one of those special requirements where they have to be embalmed. What do you have to do with the body?
Once the body is at home, you can wash the body, dress the body. There's many different things that are sort of optional, up to you, but you might want to close the eyes, set the jaw a little bit using a scarf or something like that. And then you would want to make sure that the body's in a room that's not going to be overheated, so you have to think about what month of the year is it. You know, if there's heat on in the house, you might turn off the heat in that room, and then you would want to get coolant. In home funerals, we use dry ice, and then there's a way that we pack dry ice around the body so that the temperature requirement is met.
So I'm asking the questions that I definitely want to know the answers to, but I'm hoping that they're also the questions that are on your mind. And that's really a lot of how radio comes together. It's a series of conversations. Almost everybody that you hear on the radio has had some kind of conversation with somebody before they go on to figure out what they're best suited to talk about. And what they know about and how good they are at talking in general. And that's called a pre-interview, and it's pretty essential, especially when the interview is going to air with the questions intact, rather than as part of a feature story with narration and other voices where you can do a lot of editing. But not all preparation is good preparation, as I discovered. For example, last year I interviewed an author, Stephen Elliott, and I've spoken to him on the mic a couple of times throughout my years as a journalist, and he runs a literary website called The Rumpus, which features Cheryl Strayed's awesome column, Dear Sugar. You may have heard of it. And his most recent book is called The Adderall Diaries, and he did this really awesome DIY book tour for it, where he basically took the tour the way that bands might do a tour, booking house shows in different cities and sleeping on people's couches. He let a lot of people read review copies of the book ahead of time, and if they liked it and they thought that they could get people to come to a reading, he would go to their house. And he had a lot of great experiences doing this, but he also had some awkward ones, and I wanted to ask him about that. If you've read Stephen Elliott's work, then you know that he has this thing about being dominated. If you don't read his work, then that's pretty much all you need to know. He's a bottom, and he's really, really open about it. So I thought about what I considered the perfect question for him about his book tour. So I'll let you hear how that went over.
You write a lot in this book and in some of your other books that you kind of enjoy humiliation. And I wonder if there were things about this book tour that were humiliating at times.
Well, that's not actually correct. I mean, you can't make a link between sexuality and non-sexual things like that. I mean, it's like if you're a masochist, you don't enjoy it when you stub your toe. You know what I mean? It has to be erotic. So it's not actually legitimate.
Yeah, so obviously that question was not perfect in any way, shape, or form. And after that, I just had to go ahead and lay all my cards on the table.
That was just really my way of asking if there were bad experiences that you had on this tour. I mean, you kind of alluded to the fact that you're stuck there in this person's home, and if you if you have a bad time, or if not enough people come, or it turns out to be some sort of party disaster in some way, you can't just leave.
Right.
So
there were times that were not great.
And that's what an unscripted question sounds like. But that's the beauty of the pre-recorded interview. I can cut that out. And in this case, I think I ended up cutting the whole answer and question because the answer wasn't really awesome, as other parts of the interview were. So if I wanted to keep some part of that answer, I could just do a little bit of narration over it, and then I asked him, blah, blah, blah. Generally, it's a bad idea to try to record the questions after the fact. I have only done this once. I did an interview with Dana LaRue. She runs the website The Broke Ass Bride, all about DIY as it applies to weddings. And it turned out to be a conversation about one of the way the term DIY gets co-opted by people like Martha Stewart. And she was so thoughtful about walking that line between making money at something you love and selling out. And I really, really didn't want to lose this audio. It was great. And I knew if I did the interview over again, it just wasn't gonna work out as well. I mean, I recorded my end of the interview in Portland, and somebody else recorded Dana at her house in LA. And her end just turned out just fine, and my audio was just all messed up. And I had planned to run it as a straightforward Q&A. I thought that was really the best way to present this material, so I really needed my questions. And I think I made 3 different attempts at re-recording them. When I finally thought that I had something decent, I sent the interview to Clark, my sound engineer, and he and I listened to it together, and I didn't tell him what I had done, but he said, "Why does it sound like you and this person are on 2 different drugs?" So let me give you a little bit of a taste here. The snippet comes from early in the interview when Dana was explaining how DIY has become a trend for weddings.
And weddings are sort of taking on a lot more character and spunk and uniqueness, and people really are, I think, enjoying the opportunity to get all their beloved friends and family together and say, this is who we are together and this is who we want to be.
How exactly is DIY defined when it comes to weddings, and who defines it?
The consumer really defines it. They're the people who are driving the sales. They're the people who are trafficking the blogs that cover a lot of DIY stuff. They're the people who are, voting with their dollar, so to speak.
Do you think the idea of DIY has been co-opted by the wedding industry?
Oh, absolutely. In some ways, it's helping mainstream the DIY movement, and to some people that is a good thing, and to some people that's selling out.
So the problem was that I was carefully reading my questions off the page, and I never actually do this in an interview situation. In my fourth attempt, Clark played Dana's end of the interview back to me in headphones so that I could re-record the questions in real time. And that way I was forced to do what I usually do in an interview situation, which is to write a bunch of carefully worded questions and then glance at them and kind of ad-lib to make it sound more conversational. It's not perfect, but I do think it's a lot more presentable, and I did put it on the radio, so here you go.
And weddings are sort of taking on a lot more character and spunk and uniqueness, and people really are, I think, enjoying the opportunity to get all their beloved friends and family together and say, this is who we are together and this is who we want to be.
Well, so how exactly is DIY defined when it comes to weddings, and who defines it?
The consumer really defines it. They're the people who are driving the sales. They're the people who are trafficking the blogs that cover a lot of DIY stuff. They're the people who are, voting with their dollar, so to speak.
Well, do you think that the idea of DIY has been co-opted by the wedding industry to some degree?
Oh, absolutely. In some ways, it's helping mainstream the DIY movement, and to some people that is a good thing, and to some people that's selling out.
Sometimes the hardest thing is just finding the voice that you're looking for in the first place. And I had this idea to do a show about representing yourself. It's a little bit of a heady concept, but I had thought about it from a bunch of different perspectives. Representing yourself in court was kind of the most obvious one, but I wanted to talk about how people represent themselves in the world in general, online or on a speed date, or I really wanted to talk to a tattoo artist about how they work with their clients to represent a part of themselves on their skin. And I started calling around. I asked for recommendations on Facebook and places, and somebody said I should call her friends, this couple with their own tattoo shop in Corvallis. So I called them. They were nice people, but they sounded very busy the first time I called, so I called them back. And we had a nice chat about the business of tattooing, and I learned that the holidays are a slow season for them, and I learned that tattooing for hours at a time can be hard on your lower back. And the guy said he and his wife were both custom tattoo artists, that they spent a lot of time consulting with their clients before even bringing out the ink. And it sounded like a great fit for the show. And it sounded like a great fit for this idea that I had. And he said our mutual friend had mentioned, that I was going to do this radio show. And then he sort of sounded confused, and he was like, well, you mean I'd be on the radio, like talking? And he was like, I'm not very good at that. And this was after I'd been talking to him for like 15 minutes. And he said, and this is just the last thing that I as a producer want to hear, because there's a lot of things that you can talk somebody out of. Like, you don't really need to go to that yoga class. You can come and talk to me instead, But if somebody genuinely doesn't want to be on the radio, there's just nothing I can do about it. And so I said, thanks very much, and I kind of moved on, and I went back to calling tattoo shops, and I didn't have any more recommendations, so I was just cold calling. And at first people kind of passed me on to somebody else at the shop, and then 2 shops in a row were just like, no thanks, nobody here really wants to talk to you. And I was so confused by this, because I was like, this is a chance for these artists to talk about their work in what I think is an interesting way, and it's very public. And one guy I talked to, he finally explained to me that he was just tired of hearing the media cover the tattoo industry like it was some kind of novelty act. And he said, not every tattoo has a linear story behind it. And I get that. I mean, if you had a linear story, you probably wouldn't need the tattoo. But I was complaining to my housemate at the time about media-shy tattoo artists. And he was about to go to work, and he worked at a bar up the street from our house. And he called me a couple hours later, and he said, I think I have found a tattoo artist for you. And his friend Melanie specializes in custom work, and she was there when he called, and I could kind of hear her laughing in a good-natured way in the background. And it sounded like she wanted to come on the radio. As soon as I talked to her, I knew that she'd be perfect. She's unpretentious and thoughtful, and really a refreshing contrast to these sort of reluctant tattoo artists that I've been trying to get on the radio. So let me just play you a little portion of that interview.
I think there are strains of commonality that you can find, but I think that people's specific reasons for getting them are as widely varied as people. Sometimes it's as simple as, I just want something really pretty. I just want you to draw me something really pretty. And sometimes it's a lot more profound. And sometimes people will want to invest a lot of meaning into the details of the image. So, you know, a certain number of petals on the flower, a certain number of flowers representing different people in their life, or something like that. A lot of times I think people have similar reasons that they want flowers because they're beautiful or because they're feminine. And they fit with the body really well too. You know, I think that a lot of times people are attracted to certain images because of the way that they look on the body. So a very geometric tattoo has a very different look on the body than a really flowing sort of biological tattoo.
And this just proves that it doesn't take any kind of special training to do a great pre-interview. Chris, my housemate, doesn't work in radio, but he could tell right away that Melanie is articulate and that she got my concept for the show about representing yourself. And that's not to say that this interview didn't require a lot of editing. It did. One of the things I really like about Melanie was that her answers were not canned. You know, she hadn't talked about this stuff in quite this way before, and she was thinking as she was talking to me. I think you can kind of hear that in the clip that I played. But the thing about thinking on your feet is that you tend to pause and say, and sometimes repeat yourself and end sentences with so, yeah. So I edited that stuff out. Here's the unedited version of that same portion of the interview.
I think there are strains of commonality that you can find no matter what, but I think that people's specific reasons for getting them are as widely varied as people. Sometimes it's as simple as, I just want something really pretty. I just want you to draw me something really pretty. And sometimes it's a lot more profound, and sometimes people will want to invest a lot of.
You get the idea. I don't think there's anything wrong with editing this way. I always ask myself, when this person hears the interview, are they going to remember that this is not exactly how they said what they said? And that's really important to me. In other words, I'm trying to do justice to the point that they wanted to make without, you know, taking away from the way that they talk. So leaving in a couple of those ums and pauses and things. With great editing power comes great responsibility. In general, I edit for efficiency and to make people, myself included, sound better. I think editing makes for better radio, but I'll let you be the final judge of that. If you want to listen to the rest of this piece, you can download it from our website. It's in the Representing Yourself episode, destinationdiy.org. Right, it was up there, but it's not anymore. So we definitely do a lot of prep work for each of our shows, but we like to allow for spontaneity. More often than not, spontaneity is a good thing on the radio. And sometimes I find that the best stories are the stories I find when I'm not even looking for them. I was tabling at an event last year, and the organizers had asked me to do a little presentation about the show, kind of like this. And they asked me to do it twice in the day, and the first time there was just nobody at this event. So I didn't do it. And the next scheduled appearance, the attendance was still pretty sparse, and they announced over the PA, they were really nice, they're like, Julie's gonna do this talk about Destination DIY, please go over to her table. And this really nice couple came over to my table, they were the only ones there, and the presentation ended up being pretty informal. And the guy, Jeremy, he said he was a fan of the show, and he wanted to know what I was working on. And at the time, I was putting together the DIY disasters episode. And as you might imagine, it's all about what happens when projects go horribly, horribly wrong. He said, oh, that reminds me of this time that I tried to chop down a tree and it crushed my neighbor's garage. And I was like, sir, what is your phone number? Seriously, we need to talk about this with some microphones. And I was like, don't tell me anymore, because I want to hear it for the first time in the microphone. That was pretty much the whole pre-interview. And I had a feeling that the story was going to be better if he just told it to me for the first time with the microphones on. So I think I was right. Here's a little excerpt of that.
You know, it was the kind of plan that a 12-year-old would have come up with, honestly. I just had the resources, unfortunately, to follow through with my idea. We started by pulling off all the limbs from the tree, so it looked like a giant 50-foot-tall baseball bat at that point. It was very intimidating and scary. So I tied the tree to the back of my Volvo, and I kind of thought that if I cut away at the tree that the car would pull the tree in that direction. My roommate, who did not have a driver's license, got in the car and we tied it off to the tree, and he went for it and pulled as I was cutting the tree, and everything just went horribly wrong. There was a big cracking, a big and then, the basic.
Yeah, so the tree did fall on his neighbor's garage. Nobody was hurt, so it's a very funny story. And his neighbors didn't speak any English, and the weirdest part, actually, of this story is the epilogue, and I don't want to ruin it for you. The DIY Disasters episode, this is the first story on there, so you can get that at our website, too. So thank you so much for listening and for being interested in this, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have about radio making, and I also want to say that we have some zines over there called How to Make Radio, if you want to learn a little bit more about the technical side of things. So, any questions? Yes?
In doing these shows, how do you balance preparation against spontaneity with people that you're dealing with?
Ooh.
Give them the questions prior or inform them?
I never ever give out questions ahead of time because it locks you in, you know. And people always ask. I mean, almost always they say, "Can I get those questions?" And I never do it. I mean, if I were on the other end, that's what I would say too. But I never do it because then, what if you decide to ask? What if you have that spontaneous moment and you decide to ask a question that you didn't provide? Then you're kind of breaking your agreement with that person. So, and you know, I think it provides more spontaneity if they don't know what the questions are, because then they don't have time to prepare an answer. They can kind of be thinking on their feet. So I think a lot of the spontaneity comes from the interview subjects, really, and from their kind of unexpected answers and unexpected things that they say. Yeah. Yes? Oh. That's hard to say. I think you can be more creative with radio. She was asking what attracted me to the medium. And I think you can be more creative with radio, even if it's a straightforward, you know, just, you know, reported story, than you can in print, because you have that element of sound. You know, you can set the scene a little bit. You can record what the room sounds like, what the, you know, whatever the person is doing, what that sounds like. You can get the sound of their voice and the way that they talk, which you really can't get in a print story. And I did print for a while, and I enjoyed it, and it's fun, and you kind of have that, you have a little bit more intimacy, I think, with your subject when you're working in print, because you're just calling them up and saying, you know, just talk to me. Whereas if somebody's on the radio, they know they're not just talking to you. You know, they kind of have that audience in mind, so they might not say the same kinds of things that they might say in a print interview, but I do think you get a little bit more personality. Yeah. Yes, Wayne. No, there hasn't really been a plan. I just started doing this show. I actually started it in 2006 on KBOO Radio as a half-hour monthly show, because they had a half-hour monthly time slot available, and I thought, I could do that. That would be fun. I would learn a lot, and you know, I kind of thought that the subject of DIY would never run out of material. And then it kind of grew and changed, sort of as my own radio career grew and changed. And so, you know, now it's an hour and it's on public radio, and it has a little bit more of a strict clock. Whereas if it was 28 minutes, if it was 29 minutes, if it was 30 minutes before, it was like, okay, but now I've got to be like, it has to be 59. There has to be a break here and a break here, which I think is actually a little bit better. I think the rigidity, you know, kind of constrains creativity in a good way. So I think, I hope that answers your question. Yes?
When you sort of rebranded yourself to become Destination DIY from an earlier production, what was your thoughts behind doing that?
Behind rebranding the show? So it used to be called DIY Portland, so I can tell that you have listened to it for a long time. And it was called DIY, Portland, because I had this great idea that it was like, do it yourself, Portland, but it was also like a city, like Portland, Oregon, DIY, Portland. I thought it was very clever. But whenever people wrote it up, they forgot the comma, and it drove me crazy. And I would be like, on their little blog, like, hello, thank you so much for writing about Destination DIY. By the way, there's a comma, you know? And so I was really obnoxious. And when I moved the show to OPB, I did rebrand it as Destination DIY, which is something I had been thinking about doing for quite some time. And the website had always been Destination DIY because DIY Portland was taken when I put up the website, and so I had to call it something. And I also wanted to start to include work from around the country. So we do buy work from other producers, and that also helps us to distribute it wider, you know, more widely to other markets. And so that was really the thinking behind it, just kind of make it broader and bigger.
Have you ever done a pre-interview where it goes really well, you think fantastic story, and then you get into the interview and complete, like from moment one, complete disaster? Do you have an escape plan?
I wish I had like a thing I could pull. You know, I don't always do my own pre-interviews, so sometimes somebody else does them, which I think is actually better because then I don't run into that problem of somebody saying like, well, I told you this before, you know, and they kind of know that I already know it. But I definitely have had that happen where somebody's really comfortable in a pre-interview because they're just talking to me. Like I was saying about print, you know, they're on the phone with me or they're just in a room with just me and there's no microphone. I'm not recording it, you know, I might be busy taking some notes. And they're fantastic and they're really comfortable and, you know, they're not really thinking about, you know, oh, should I say this or should I not say this? And then when they get in the interview, they're like a deer in the headlights, like they're just frozen, you know, and I try to really smile at them and make them comfortable and like, you know, and if it's pre-recorded, you know, I can kind of stop it and say like, what's going on? Can I get you a cup of water? Like, can I make you more comfortable somehow? Is there any, you know, I also try to start off before I turn on the recorder to say, do you have any questions? Before I, you know, lob all these questions at you, do you want to ask me anything? And I think that helps make people comfortable, but I have run into that problem and there's very little that one can do about it. Yes.
Who are some people that inspire you as journalists and other radio shows?
Oh, wow. I have to say Brooke Gladstone from On the Media. She's like my radio hero. I love her. Let's see. 99% Invisible, if anybody hasn't downloaded that podcast yet, Roman Mars does that podcast, and it's awesome. And he just did an amazing Kickstarter campaign that's like the biggest public radio Kickstarter campaign ever. His show is really, really rad. I like his show a lot. And let's see, who else? Well, Dime Roberts, who's here locally, has been a mentor to me. She's a radio documentary maker, and she does really excellent work. And she's really helped me kind of thinking about the business side of things and the creative side of things. So that's just a few. I know I'm forgetting people, but yeah. Anyone else? Questions? Yes. I haven't yet. I mean, I think the key is that we really think about DIY as a very broad umbrella under which lots of things can fit. So, you know, we've talked about home funerals, home birth, we've talked about everything in between. And, you know, I'm always finding about things that people are doing that I'm like, I didn't know that you could do that, you know? And I have kind of started, each show usually has a theme, and the one that we're working on currently, which will be out sometime after September the 8th, we will not have a theme for the first time. So we're going to kind of try that out. I had a bunch of stories that were really cool that that just kind of didn't fit neatly under a theme, and I was like, I'm not gonna force that, you know. So I think that maybe themes I may have kind of not run out of, but I've kind of decided I don't want to be too rigid about that. But I haven't run out of stories, and people are always pitching me fantastic, interesting things that either they do or they heard of somebody that does and they can produce it. So, yeah. Person closest to me, then person behind her. How far out do we plan the themes? Well, we try to come up with them. So we do 5 episodes a season, which ends up being like a calendar year because I have this other job. And so usually at the beginning of the year, we'll kind of lay out what are the 5 things that we want to do as the themes, so we can kind of start to think about the stories that we already have and the stories that people are pitching, and kind of solicit pitches from producers. There's a mailing list of independent radio producers that I'm on, and I kind of send things out and say these are the things we're thinking about, and we want to organize them under these themes. So we try to think about them ahead of time, but also, you know, be able to kind of move and change as things, you know, come in. So. Yeah, usually think about them a year ahead of time, I guess. And you do have a question.
Yeah, you just mentioned that your story spectrum is pretty broad. So I'm wondering, how do you interpret DIY? What's the essence of it?
Well, I think the essence of DIY is something that that is accessible, that people can do without purchasing a lot of expensive tools or materials. And I mean, it's not always it, but I'm always those are the stories I find most interesting, and the things that are accessible to people, and also that are innovative in some way, that are creative, that people are doing with limited resources perhaps, and that sometimes makes it more creative. So it's a pretty broad spectrum. I think pretty much anything that people make or do that doesn't require the help of a large institution of some kind, that fits under DIY for me. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
What has been the most amazing story?
What has been the most amazing story? Oh my goodness, that is so hard to say. Well, the story that I loved the most, I did this show when it was called DIY Portland, called DIY History, and I interviewed my grandparents, and those are the most precious interviews to me. Like, I have them on my iPod, and when I put it on shuffle and they come up, I have to listen to the whole thing because I just love them so much. They're such treasures, and I hope that that show kind of inspired other people to do that because it's such a great thing to have. And obviously that's amazing to me for my own personal reasons, but I think, gosh, it's so hard to say what the most amazing stories are because I like them all a lot. But if I have to pick a favorite, I like the rituals episode a lot. We did this one story in the rituals episode, it's the last one in there, about a newspaper funeral. And it was about the St. John's Sentinel, which was a local newspaper here in town that I actually wrote for a short time, and they went under, and the publisher decided to have this huge send-off. Basically, he had a lot of papers that he couldn't keep anywhere, and he decided he was going to burn them in this big kind of bonfire ritual, and he went all out. Like, he had a mask and a cape and a script and a whole thing, and it was amazing. I mean, I was just like, what a great thing, what a great creative way to say goodbye to this institution that, you know, really brought this neighborhood together, and it was surprising and great. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yes?
Speaking to that question, what range or percentage of stores that do with DIY, like stuff, actual things versus experiential?
Okay, making things versus making experiences. I would say it's more about making things just because that's more common. We did a whole show called I Made That, which was all about objects. And it was all about what makes you, what about the process or the end product makes you excited to point and say, I made that. But then we have done these ritual shows and the Representing Yourself show, and to some degree the disaster show, because a lot of times that didn't end up with an object, even if that was the intention. It's really about the experience. But I think the story is really always about the experience. It's always about, why did you do this? How did you do it? What happened to you along the way? What did you learn? How did it change you? And those are kind of the questions that we're most interested in. The thing could be totally, I mean, for that, I made that show, somebody made a doghouse, and it was like, that doesn't sound exciting, but the story was great. It was about how they made this doghouse that was like a complete model of their neighbor's home, and it looked exactly like it. And it was super elaborate, and like the guy, it's kind of a mystery, like you never learn why this guy did this, because he's just like a big weirdo, and it's really fascinating. But so it's not necessarily about what you make, it's about why and how and what happens. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes? Have I ever had anybody get really emotional, was the question on the show, and what happened? I can't think of a time that I have had anybody like really break down. I mean, we've had some emotional stories that we've done, and I think if that happened, I mean, it's pre-recorded, so I would have to make a decision about whether or not I would edit that out. And I mean, I think that would be a really serious question about, you know, does it serve the story to have this in here, or, you know, is it slightly exploitative, and what does it do for the listener? What does it mean to this person? In the DIY Rituals episode, we talked about I talked to somebody who had done like a DIY memorial service for a friend, and that was a really emotional story, obviously, and there were two stories that were like that in the show where I decided to edit myself out of it because I felt like their emotions were so strong that even though they weren't, you know, actively crying during the story, I mean, the emotion that you could hear in their voice was so strong that when you heard my voice in contrast to it, just sounded totally weird. Not quite as weird as the wedding interview, but weird. And so I edited it so it was just a kind of a continuous story that they were telling rather than, you know, a back and forth Q&A. Yes?
Over the years that you've been doing this show, how has, you know, the rise of the internet and social media changed your planning process and, you know, adding content and not just having these 5 things in here? Like, how has that changed?
how has the internet changed how we do the show, was the question. And it's a great question. I think that when I started the show in 2006, as I said, it started as this monthly half-hour show on KBOO, and it was on the third Thursday of every month, and I was putting lots and lots of work into it, and I thought, who is going to mark their calendar for like, oh, it's the third Thursday, I better listen to that show, right? Nobody's going to do that. And so I immediately, like in like the third or fourth show, I was like, I've got to find another way to get people to get this out there, to get people to listen to it. And I immediately found a way to, podcast it and distribute it that way. So I think that the show has always had a life outside of the radio, even though it's funny the way the radio makes it seem more legitimate. But I think, I started putting it on this service called Radio for All, which is like a free service that you can put things on, and other community stations and college stations can download them. And the first time I did that, somebody downloaded my show, and it was broadcasting in Nova Scotia, and I was like, cool! It was like this breakthrough, like, oh, the internet! That's the way to get people to listen to the show. And it does allow us to add extra content. I've done a lot of extended interviews. If there's an interview where, you're cutting away, and then you realize, oh, I really don't want to cut anymore. I'm starting to cut the meat out of this interview, but it's got to be just a little shorter. Then I can put an extended version on the web, and that makes me feel like, all the people get to hear all the good stuff that didn't fit in the show for timing. And we do some stuff on the podcast that's podcast special, that was not for the show, that's for, like we went to the Seattle Mini Maker Fair in June and did a podcast from there and just kind of walked around, asked people what they were making, and then just put it together in a little 7-minute podcast that, it wasn't really appropriate for the show, but it was great to have something that was this just happened, and now you can hear it on the podcast, so that's kind of more appropriate for internet distribution. And we do some photos and videos and stuff that's additional content. I'd like to do more of that, but I need to get a little bit more help in order to do that. Anybody else? Great, well, thank you all so much for being here. Yeah.